Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm David Blight, Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center here at Yale. And this is another, not our last, but one of our last Wednesdays at lunch. Wednesday at GLC at lunch, I think is what we now call them. And we're very pleased and lucky to have Max Flomen here as a 1-month fellow. Max teaches at West Virginia University. He's a scholar of Borderlands history, and that will become clear in a moment. And by the way, Max, I love that map you had up on our poster. That, in fact, thanks again to Melissa McGrath, who makes all of our posters, because it shows the Nueces and the Rio Grande. And I have, in an online lecture, I have mispronounced Nueces once, and I heard from a lot of people in Texas about that pronunciation, so I never get it wrong again. Anyway, I can't wait to hear this talk. Max did his BA and his MA at McGill University in Montreal, which is where he's from. Then he went way out west to UCLA to do his PhD. Great place to do the history of the borderlands in the West and so on. This project, this book he's writing, the same as the title of the talk today, Beyond Mountains, Marronage and Revolution in the Borderlands from 1500 to 1850. Note the chronology. Max doesn't have a decade. He has 3 centuries and more. He's also published in the Journal of Civil War History, the Journal of Southern History, the Journal of the Santa Fe Center for Advanced Research, which is a major anthropological center in Santa Fe. I've given a talk there myself. That's a great place great place to be, but also a great place to do research, and other places as well. I think Max is only in his 4th year now at West Virginia, and this is a great project. Max, welcome to the GLC, and it's all yours.
Thanks so much, David, for that introduction. And before we get started, I just wanted to extend my sincere appreciation to the Gilder Lehrman Center and Yale University for having me here for the month. This has been a long time coming. I was first honored with this opportunity back in 2020. So it's been a while since the ball got rolling. And on that note, a really special thanks to Michelle Zaks for staying in touch and making this happen. And another special thanks to Melissa McGrath as well for putting together the poster for today's talk. And of course, a major thanks to you, the audience, for joining us this afternoon. So let me just pull up my PowerPoint and we will get started. All right. So my talk today is actually a little bit different than initially advertised. The title is Infiltration and Insurrection in the Borderlands of Northern New Spain between the 1640s and roughly 1700. So we will not attempt to do 3.5 centuries of borderland history quite yet. Now, this talk is really going to be focused on the 2nd chapter of my book, which, as David mentioned, is titled Beyond Mountains, Marronage and Revolution in the Borderlands between the 16th and 19th centuries. So I just want to say a few things about the broader project, how it developed, what its main arguments and interventions are before we delve into some details. So the topic, as the title hopefully suggests, is about indigenous and allied resistance, confrontational opposition to Euro-American empires in the borderlands of North America. And those are mainly the western or southwestern or northern borderlands, depending on how you're positioning yourself geographically. And the empires we're talking about are mainly the Spanish Empire, but also the French and eventually US empires as well. So the participants, the agents, the people in this story are largely nomadic indigenous groups like the Comanche, the Apache, and others. But in terms of their allies, I include all peoples who chose or were forced to join those groups. We're talking about traders, Maroons, bandits, captives, and a whole host of people that were often described as renegades. That is, people who abandoned Euro-American societies and ended up living with native peoples, often adopting many features of the host culture. So there's two tracks to the arguments that I make in this book. Okay, so first off, I want to emphasize in terms of my focus and my argumentation that we're talking about militant, that is confrontational opposition to colonialism and imperialism. Okay, so as we know a great deal about resistance, accommodation, acculturation in a variety of colonial settings, I am specifically focused on those who chose to oppose militarily or in other confrontational ways what was happening to their worlds. Okay, so even though we have a very broad geographical and temporal focus, the types of people, the types of groups that I'm focused on is relatively precise. And one of the things I want to accomplish in this book is tracking the changes within that oppositional movement over time. It wasn't just one set of ideas or practices that people used to oppose empire. These practices did change. And so there's two themes, types of change that I track over time. The first is the use of physical space and ideas about space. So here we're talking about movement, whether that is retreat, taking refuge, actions. That's really what we're focused on in this regard. What did people actually do? Second thing the book focuses on is ideas. Okay, so what did people think? What motivated them to take these actions? And some of the ideologies that come forward in my research are ideas about autonomy, preserving independence, ideas about egalitarianism, that is, ideas about a more equal type of society, and of course, ideas that oppose slavery. So anti-slavery ideas are also ideological features of this militant opposition. I'd like to say a few things about my project's origin. So I think, for many people in the audience, I'm imagining are not necessarily coming from a background in Indigenous history or Borderlands history, but you're going to hear a lot of terms and a lot of ideas that borrow heavily from Atlantic history, which has also been extremely influential in colonial American history and on my work, most certainly. So while the content might be less familiar to folks, hopefully some of the ideas or terms like Marronage and revolution resonate with folks working in other contexts. And then, of course, there's been a number of important books. I've only listed two of them, many, many more. I'm always reminding myself or feeling that I stand on the shoulders of so many giants in many different fields, many of whom passed away many years ago, and I continue to learn from. But books like Brett Rushfort's Bonds of Alliance, I thought beautifully interwove Atlantic and Indigenous history, and one was a work that I read early on in grad school and really inspired me to investigate this history in the Southwest and Northern Mexico. And another book which has had a tremendous influence and impact on the progression of my ideas as they've evolved from dissertation to book manuscript is Andres Resendez's The Other Slavery, which inspired me in a number of ways. One is, at least in one of those ways, is to tackle a broad geographical and chronological framework for this work. And so, among other things, what The Other Slavery did is, centered the importance, the significance of Indigenous enslavement to the history of our hemisphere. So one of the things that I'm trying to accomplish in Beyond Mountains is to tell the story of the other emancipation. So if there is, this other slavery, which we have started to uncover, obviously many scholars are working on this, can we start to narrate coherently the ways in which the other slavery was ultimately thwarted and dismantled? So that is a little bit about the larger project. Try and situate folks a little bit here as well, because again, I'm imagining that a number of us are less familiar with the geography of Northern Mexico present-day U.S. Southwest. So I got a couple of maps over here that I just wanted to share with you. This is broadly the map on the left in terms of northern New Spain, the area that I am focused on, which eventually will also include places like Texas over here and Louisiana a little bit further east. So these are the main provinces of New Spain. Currently, Mexico, we have places like Sonora, Nueva Vizcaya, New Mexico, Coahuila, Nuevo León, and as I mentioned, eventually Texas, Tamaulipas, and a few other provinces will be added in the northeastern quadrant. I want to take an opportunity just to share another interactive map that, again, I will hope will help situate my talk. Great. So now we are looking at a Spanish map that was originally produced in 1728. This is a copy from 1770. And so one of the things I really appreciate about early modern Spanish cartography is their honesty about indigenous power. So you'll notice that the provinces of northern New Spain, they look a lot different. They are much smaller than the modern day states to which some of them correspond. You'll notice that, something like New Mexico is really just a cluster of villages along the upper Rio Grande, and that is tenuously connected to modern day El Paso. You'll notice, sort of comparing another frontier province, that Texas is, again, a much more slender area of European control than is often illustrated in other maps. And of course, on this map as well, one of, I think, its best features is the ways in which the cartographer, who's a military engineer, illustrates the presence and power of indigenous peoples. For example, the Apache groups living north of the Rio Grande on the southern plains. And so the area that I'll be describing and talking about this afternoon is this one right here, sort of the northern edges of the province of Nueva Vizcaya, which was the largest, most populous, and the wealthiest of all of the northern provinces. It had large numbers of livestock, as well as silver mines that made it really the crown jewel of the northern provinces. Now, having said that, it was far less populated and far less valuable to the empire than the provinces further south. So over here, you see a number of forts, as well as settlements that sort of ringed the mountains that surrounded an area the Spanish called the Bolson de Mapimi. And this Bolson was a very arid, very rocky, very difficult place to live, and served as a natural refuge for many indigenous groups, many people who were fleeing exploitation, enslavement in the mines, haciendas, and ranches that surrounded it. So this is basically an elevated plateau surrounded by mountains. It's basically a giant bowl that served as a refuge for many different people, which the cartographer mentions on his map. If you read Spanish, you'll see that it says, this is a land inhabited by the enemy Indians, and then he goes on to list a number of tribes, including other nations who have almost been extinguished. So the rhetoric of indigenous extinction, eradication has also been incorporated into this map. What made this area so valuable was the silver strikes that began around here, the city of Parral, in the early 1630s. So this silver strike initiated immense disruptions within this area. It's in the 1630s that the Spanish frontier begins to roll northward once again, producing all sorts of disruptions ecologically, slave raids, epidemics, all radiate outwards, from these zones. So we can come back to this map. I just wanted to give folks a sense of what it looked like back then. Go back to our slideshow here. Okay, So we're back on some other maps. Again, these are from the 17th century, so a little bit later than the period I'm generally focused on, but they have hopefully some utility for what we'll be talking about today. Because what Beyond Mountains is really trying to get at is this hidden transcript, this kind of other this other perspective that takes us beyond the mountains that ring the colonial world, all of these settlements down here. This is, again, sort of another view of Nueva Vizcaya. We have Parás, and yeah, Paral would be a little bit further away. But there's a lot going on, excuse me, in these mountainous regions. So what my research, what my work tries to investigate is the activities, the ideas that are being exchanged beyond the mountains, beyond what the colonial archive usually allows us to see. So the sort of beyond mountains metaphor is both literal and figurative. People escaped colonial society. They fled into the hills. They went beyond the mountains to find refuge, to find community amongst independent indigenous groups. But the use of the mountains and valleys dichotomy is also a discursive and archival one that challenges us as students of indigenous history to look beyond what the colonial archive reveals on the face of things. So we want to find out what was going on at places like the Mesa de Catujanes, which was a long-term redoubt refuge for indigenous groups. So even though a lot of these places are physically quite proximate, you'll see that the Mesa is just 100 or less kilometers east of the major city of Monclova. They are also worlds apart. So we're moving across different types of spaces and distances in today's talk, both physical and ideological. Say a few things before we finally get into it about the significance, hopefully the significance of my work. So really on the broadest level, kind of extrapolating beyond the particulars of my field, Southwestern, Borderlands history, all of that. What I'm trying to do in Beyond Mountains is offer a critique of narratives that emphasize the roles of nation states and empires in emancipation. So oftentimes I think, especially those of us coming from a background in US history, when we hear things like abolition and emancipation, we're thinking of people like Frederick Douglass, the Union Army, Abraham Lincoln, those types of actors who brought about the end of slavery. Of course, none of those agents are present in the context I'm working in. So how can we craft narratives of emancipation that feature different communities, ones that are generally more localized and smaller in scale? And so that is one of the things I hope to accomplish in my book. The second critique that I make in my work is a critique of the racialization of resistance. That is the ways in which many historians have focused on specific tribal nations or other groups of people, nation states, interest groups like the abolitionists to tell these stories. And because race exerted such a powerful influence on people then and us now, it has been very difficult, I think, to tell stories that transcend the boundaries of race. And the people that I examine, the people that I study, they had, of course, ideas, evolving ideas about race, but they included a diverse number of people coming from different class, ethnic, and racial backgrounds, as we will see. So by looking at groups of people who were themselves of mixed race or brought together peoples of different nationalities, I think we can start to build a quite different picture of what emancipation looked like in much of the continent. I think the narratives that we have now tend to favor areas that were or become part of the United States. It's, of course, a lot of challenges, and I'm sure other folks will help me or try and help me work through some of them this afternoon. But the sources themselves are very challenging because they are produced by the forces of empire, soldiers, priests, and others. And the terms that those people use in ethnography and in chronicles and in reports and in the other types of sources they produce, they provide a discourse that emphasizes, as you may imagine, the barbarism or savagery of native peoples, who they viewed as their enemies, that they were working very diligently to destroy. Something else that is worth noting about the sources is the language of criminality. So not only are native peoples described as barbaros and related terms, but the people who join them and native opponents of the regime themselves are also described in criminal language. They are vagabonds, they are pirates, they are highwaymen, they are rebels, they are infidels. Okay, so the language of criminality, especially the criminalization of movement and politics, makes these sources very challenging, but also very fruitful to work with. And another challenge, of course, that I've experienced working with such a broad area and with so many different Indigenous and European groups is the challenge of lumping, that is making generalizations versus splitting, that is getting down into the granular details. And that is, of course, I think a challenge all historians, all scholars can appreciate. So let me tell you a few things about how I have tried to work through some of these challenges. This is just a note on some of my methods. And really, a lot of these methods have to do with my assumptions, the hopefully expert assumptions that I have made as a historian. And a lot of these sort of aphorisms that you see below are borrowed directly from a historical archaeologist who I admire very much, named Stephen Lexon. So thank you, Stephen Lexon. So one of the things that Lexon does in his big histories of the Southwest is operate with a certain set of assumptions in mind that can help us make Indigenous peoples, these opponents of empire, real people of history, as opposed to just enemies lurking in the mountains who only show up to raid, destroy, plunder. And these are, really little ways they are plotted and narrated in many sources. So basically what I'm assuming, what I'm arguing, or the assumptions that underlie my arguments, is that native peoples, they do not need to bear the burden of being people of history. We do not need to prove that people were talking about what was going on in the world. French peasants in the 1400s, they knew there was a pope in Rome, right? I think it's fair to say that early modern Indigenous peoples living in the mountains, living in the valleys, they knew that their hemisphere had been invaded by people coming across the waters, and they gained information, they shared information about the colonial invasion over time. So distances can be dealt with. People were talking, people were sharing information, exchanging goods, exchanging ideas. So even though we're talking about a very broad area, I think that we can say everything was connected. The borderlands, these different pockets of it, were in conversation with each other. So people knew something was going on, even if they didn't know everything. And finally, sort of others, it's not really a method, of course, it's sort of at the core of in my view, the historical profession is to tell stories. So we will tell some stories today. Briefly review the table of contents of my project so you have a sense of the larger whole. The first chapter deals with the religiously inspired uprisings that rocked northern New Spain during the first half of the 17th century. Second chapter delves into the world of spies and saboteurs who work to reinvigorate resistance during the second half of the 17th century. The third chapter introduces the French connection, the French invasion that flowed along the Mississippi Valley, bringing African peoples into the heart of the continent, as well as plantation slavery. So those groups also play an important role in the story as it develops in the fourth chapter, which is about the rise of nomadic societies during the 18th century, especially Comanche and Apache peoples, who became important centers for hosting militant opposition. And then the final chapter examines the age of revolutions from this perspective of the continental interior and tries to reframe these political upheavals from the perspective of Indigenous groups like the Apache, Comanche, and others. Okay, let's get to it in terms of what I really wanted to talk to you all about today. So folks may be familiar with the Pueblo Uprising or Revolt of 1680. This is a major indigenous uprising in New Mexico that took place in 1680, 81, and managed to liberate the Pueblo peoples. They liberated themselves of Spanish rule for nearly 20 years before the Reconquest began in 1696. And the Pueblo Revolt was actually part of a much broader set of uprisings, and this is what the Spanish called them at the time, during the late 17th century. So when scholars have sort of examined the whole rather than the different parts, like the Pueblo Revolt, they have broadened their and our perspective on these events. So beginning with the pioneering historian Jack Forbes, who was writing about this stuff way back in 1960. People like Forbes and Resendez, others, they have described not a single revolt, but a broader constellation of uprisings as either the Great Southwestern Revolt or the Great Northern Uprisings. We'll go with Northern, sort of orienting ourselves from the New Spanish perspective. So taken as a whole, dozens of major rebellions broke out against Spanish colonial rule, beginning in the 1660s, really, and continuing all the way through the early 18th century. And the historiography of these revolts, sort of scholarly interpretations of these revolts, has changed quite a bit over not just decades, but centuries, because the history of these uprisings began right away. It was first written by the Spanish priests and officers who were charged with putting down these rebellions. And certainly from the perspective of Franciscan and Jesuit priests, the major explanation they offered for these outbreaks was the role of Satan and other demonic forces here on earth. So from their perspective, the revival of indigenous religions, the leading role taken by shamans in many of these rebellions was a clear sign to them that satanic forces were at work trying to undo Christian conversions, missionization that had been underway for 3 or 4 generations at this point. So of course, the historiography has moved on from those types of satanic religious explanations that were first put forward in the time period itself. Another thing that has changed in terms of our interpretation is, as I mentioned, a move away from this focus on the Pueblo themselves, which is sort of an artifact, I think, of U.S. exceptionalism more broadly, and more indigenous groups, including those who live south of the present-day international border, have been included in this narrative. Now, more recently and more accurately, historians have emphasized ecological factors, the impacts of livestock and new types of crops that really disrupted indigenous lifeways, especially for village people like the Pueblos. And this is one of the reasons, along with Spanish tribute demands, enslavement, and exploitation, that prompted them to revolt. There was also a series of droughts and bad harvests that further inspired these revolts. That's what many people argue. And of course, the religious and cultural conflict has always remained at the forefront of our interpretations. So what my work in the second chapter and what you'll be hearing about today tries to do, it builds on and it hopefully departs a little bit from these interpretations. So my point of emphasis when I examine the Great Northern Uprisings is to emphasize, to highlight the critical role played by rebels working individually or in small groups. Okay, let me say something about these people. So the term that was often used to describe these rebels was Ladino. That is, native peoples who had some experience and knowledge of Hispanic culture. Generally speaking, this means they had probably been baptized, spent a little bit time in the missions, or knew people who had. That is, they have some knowledge of Roman Catholicism and its requirements. Just as importantly, they have some knowledge of Castilian, Spanish, as well as Nahuatl, the kind of lingua franca of the northern frontier. So these are people who are comfortable moving within colonial society. Many of them have been born within, usually on the margins of frontier society. But these are people who ultimately make the choice or are forced to leave society. That is, they become Maroons. I use Marronage and the term Maroon quite broadly in my work. I extrapolate it beyond African and African-American history, and I apply it to indigenous groups. And in fact, the word itself was first applied to indigenous slaves who escaped Spanish mines and plantations in the Caribbean. So these people, once they joined rebel groups living beyond the mountains in the Sierras, they were described oftentimes as domestic enemies. This is the term that comes up a lot in the sources. Another term is enemigo casero, that is literally a homemade or enemy within the house. Another common term the Spanish use for these people is infidente, which is sort of more literally translated as infidel, but with the sort of setting aside the kind of present religious context that word has, really what they're talking about is people who have abandoned, from their point of view, loyalty to the king, to the imperial regime. So these Ladinos, these domestic enemies, these Maroons, these rebels, and all of these terms were applied to them at the time. They flee, they run away, or they are captured, and they take up life with the independent mobile groups who are living beyond the mountains. And I've got some of them highlighted on this map that I have drawn. And these are people like the Tobosos, the Salineros, and others who are living, around and within the Bolson de Mapim. So these are folks who are escaping the mines, the missions, the farms, the ranches, the sweatshops, where they have been trapped and taking up the struggle of their independent neighbors. So who became involved in these rebel cadres? Who were these people? What were their motives and what were their roles? I have a little handmade graphic here that is hopefully helpful to imagine on a somewhat general level the types of relationships, the types of networks that existed in this borderland. So we're focused on the people at the center, these rebels, these Maroons, these so-called domestic enemies, who sometimes form their own groups, which the Spanish referred to as cuadrillas, which is basically a gang of livestock rustlers. So this is one of the main activities these groups undertook and is, of course, criminalized by the Spanish colonial state. At other times, these rebel groups are directly incorporated into and working with independent, usually nomadic, indigenous groups living in the Sierras and in other cases on the Great Plains. So there's movement onto the grasslands, onto the savannas, into the Sierras. Many of these rebels have no shortage of motivation. These are people who have experienced the trauma of slavery or indentured servitude directly and are reacting to their marginalization by colonial labor regimes. These are people who have been forcibly indoctrinated into Roman Catholicism in the missions. These are people who have experienced physical, psychological abuse in their workplaces. Generally speaking, these are former cowboys, former miners, former servants who find themselves among these rebel bands. So some of them arrive as volunteers, as recruits who are actively seeking exit from colonial society and a more independent and sustainable life in the mountains. It should be emphasized as well that not everyone is a volunteer. Many of these people, especially women and children, are kidnapped, they are taken hostage, they're taken prisoner, and they are forcibly abducted and incorporated into rebel societies, often performing very similar work to what they had been doing previously. So we can see that, those types of relationships illustrated over here. Because the rebels are familiar with colonial society, because they are able to move into colonial spaces and then back into the mountains, they are really important as spies and saboteurs for the nomadic nations living elsewhere. So there is a number of relationships taking place between the rebels and their allies in the backcountry. So people are exchanging goods, they're exchanging information, they're finding refuge, and they are also finding ideological inspiration. These are places where they can perform traditional indigenous ceremonies, which they are perhaps returning to, or in other cases, they've never been exposed to as well. They have lived most of their lives up to this point within colonial society. So by way of concluding, just like to tell a couple of stories. Hopefully we'll have time for both, but the one I'd like to start with is a story of a man named Juan Andres, who comes before the Spanish authorities at Parral in 1657. So well before the Pueblo Revolt, but as I mentioned, that is only one of a number of major uprisings to which people like Juan Andres and other rebel cadres contribute decisively. So this is the cover of Juan Andres's criminal case file that we're looking at over here. You can see at the center, this is a criminal case. It says, against Juan Andres, Indian, for his involvement in murders, various murders, the murder of several people. And this was the line that really drew my attention to this whole world, this world of the domestic enemy. He is also charged with espía doble. So he's basically charged with being a double agent. He is, on one face of things, an anonymous worker. He's a servant and cowboy working in the area. But in fact, as it turns out, at least according to the authorities, he's also a secret enemy. He's described as a malevolent and infamous robber and secret supporter of the Toboso enemy. The Toboso were a tribal nation generally opposed to the Spanish, living in the mountains. So Juan Andres is characteristic of many of the rebels, many of the renegades who involve themselves in opposition to the imperial regime. When he comes before the authorities in 1657, he's in his 40s, so he's a little bit older than some of the other folks you see involved. There's a wide range of ages that have come across in these cases, and Juan Andres is a man, but both men and women were actively involved in these rebel cadres. So among other things that we learn about Juan Andres, about his life, is that he was an independent servant. Unlike many others, he was not enslaved and he was not indentured. So he showed up in Parral a relatively free person with no attachments. There's no mention of other family members or a partner or wife. So Juan Andres, as I mentioned, he seems very much like other indigenous workers who are sort of moving around looking for work within the mining and ranching economy of the northern frontier. But as testimonies are provided by other frontier workers, we learn a little bit more about this man. We learn that he functioned as a healer. He's described as a curer. So he probably was practicing, traditional medicine within the hacienda quarters, providing some medical resources for his co-workers. He's also someone who traveled in disguise. Something else that comes out of a lot of these sources was the attempts of the rebels, often successful, to steal clothing, to steal uniforms so that they could disguise themselves for the purposes of infiltration and spying and providing uniforms, outfits, clothing for people working in the backcountry. Juan Andres, like others, also provides a lot of alibis. Okay, and these alibis, whether they are true or not, is very difficult to determine. But these alibis, I think, if nothing else, they give us a sense of how many people were coming and going, how many people claim to be something or claim to be somewhere as this rebellion unfolds. So Juan Andres is accused of spying. What were these people spying? What were they looking at? Well, they're looking for a number of things. They're looking to see where Spanish soldiers are, when they go on patrol, when they are congregating, when forts, when caravans are most vulnerable. This is the information that is really critical to rebel forces in order to launch ambushes and raids more successfully. People like Juan Andres, renegades, rebels, working in these small cadres are also really critical as fencers. That is, from the perspective of the colonial regime, they are facilitating the buying and selling of stolen goods. So they often obtain horses and mules, stolen clothing, stolen goods, and are able to redistribute it to other groups. So they play an important role within the kind of Sierra economy that is hidden from our view. And one of the last things I'll mention about the career of Juan Andres and other rebel agents is their role in assassinations and raids. So oftentimes I think especially the way it's narrated, both by the sources and by contemporary historians, is that indigenous violence, thinking about, let's say, like the Comanche Empire or Apache peoples, they're raiding and trading. And the violence, especially when it's abstracted on a broad scale, often I think appears to be rather endemic. It's kind of this Hobbesian war of all against all. People are just raiding and trading and raiding and trading, captives and cousins, all of that stuff. All well and good, much of it true. But something I want to emphasize in my work is the targeted and political nature of much of this violence. So yes, Juan Andres is accused and implicated in attacks on caravans that result in the theft of goods. They managed to capture some of the governor's correspondence, so they're really interested in information. They also capture clothing in one of these raids, but Juan Andres is also implicated in the murder of an overseer at one of the haciendas. And this is a activity that I see come up in a lot of the sources, not indiscriminate, these killings, very specific targets for a lot of this political violence. So you have overseers who are being targeted, you have Spanish priests who are being targeted. These are, of course, representatives of the regime and its most corrosive effects. Other targets of the violence include other indigenous people who are working as informants for the colonial regime, as well as couriers. So targeting the nodes of information, trying to obtain information and deny it to the enemy is a really important activity on the part of these rebel cadres. And by undertaking this work, they facilitate and make possible the success of the much larger and more visible uprisings that take place during these decades. So obviously a lot more one could say, a whole second story that we could unfold, but I will save some of that for the Q&A, and I really appreciate everyone who joined today and took the time to listen. So thank you very much, all. I'll turn it over to David.
Yeah, well, thank you, Max. This is absolutely fascinating, and I have a couple of questions to start with.
Sure.
But we're getting questions in now, and we welcome your questions out there in video streaming land, and here they come. Let me start with one, though. All that you said about ideology, and I sense you want to say more about that. You didn't have time. How do you get it? What is the research that gets you at this notion, this problem of ideas? Is it simply there in the sources? Or do you have to read against grain to find them? I'm fascinated with how we understand ideology in essentially early modern or pre-modern history.
Yeah, absolutely. It's obviously a tremendous, challenge, and I don't have, a special sauce or formula, that I've used to read the sources in a radically new way. That's something I really, want to emphasize. I have not uncovered, some cache of sources in which things are clearly laid out. So I do the kind of work that, all ethno-historians, all historians of the colonial encounter, especially during the early modern period, are required to do. That is, I read a lot of, or I read into actions in order to uncover people's ideas. So, for me, it's like what people did is a reflection of what they thought. Okay, That's something, you know, I think any historian of indigenous peoples or colonial encounters has been trained to do.
Mhm.
Alongside that, the sources are on occasion very rich and do provide us a little bit more insight into people's ideas that is actually on the page, on the record, written out, if not explicitly, then it's at least it's getting us a little bit closer to what people were thinking. So the case that I was just talking about is a good example. If you know anything about you know, the civil system, which the Spanish, you know, and others are using, it's an inquisitorial system. You were asked a series of questions, and of course, the types of questions that they ask, these interrogators, are not all the questions I would have liked to ask, or other historians. But on occasion, they do ask directly about the morale or motives of the rebels. And the word they often use specifically is ánimo, which is a Spanish word that you would probably translate literally as spirit. So they'll ask, like, what is the spirit of the rebels? Like, the people you've been hiding with in the mountains, what's going on over there? How do those people feel? And so I think really what they're asking is, what is the morale? What is the intentions? Sometimes they ask that as well, though all too rarely. And so you do get some really intriguing answers in response, in which people will say explicitly things like, we are determined to fight on. There is no talk of surrender. You know, you have sent emissaries, you've sent peace feelers. It's a no for us. We feel that we have a chance to win. So this, to me, tells us something. You know, these are not the losers of history. These are not people who know how it's going to go. You know, there is all to play for, and they feel that they have a real chance to succeed in, you know, their endeavors.
Oh, that's great. I mean, all of which is a way of saying the historian has to use imagination as well about other people's imagination.
Yes, there's certainly, you know, that well, I won't call it a skill.
Yeah.
That attempt is being made.
We've got a great question here from my colleague Ann Eller, who is a scholar of the Caribbean and this part of the world. Anne asks, well, first she says, this is absolutely fascinating. I wonder if you might put together this beyond mountains with the Haitian proverb that is similar. Deyemont, gemont. Beyond mountains, there are more mountains. One way to interpret the proverb, she says, is that it joins geography and time, sketching how threats or problems and possibility of survival repeat again and again and again. Do you see a similar epistemology joining resistance to the landscape in your context? Did that come through okay?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Anne, for that question. And yeah, you're spot on. I mean, that, you know, the title, you know, the title itself and the ideas that I'm trying to get at in the title, that comes directly from that Haitian proverb, and, you know, from the, you know, the name of Haiti itself, which is the land of tall mountains. So of course, the area I'm looking at is also physically, topographically very mountainous. So that helps. It's actually true. But, you know, on a kind of more discursive, ideological, figurative way, yes, this expression, this metaphor of mountains, of continuous struggle, you know, that ebbs and flows across time is at the heart of my work. It is these ideas that have inspired me to do this. So absolutely. And if there's other ways I can conceptualize it and reinforce the connection between Borderlands and Caribbean history and sort of the ideas that underlie them, then I would like to do that.
Yeah, well, that's great. And again, Anne, thank you for that question. There's a question here about, and I might broaden it a bit to get you to reflect on this. There's a question here about whether the Pueblos and other tribes, the questioner says, did they speak English? Did they learn, I'm sorry, did they speak Spanish? Did they learn Spanish sufficiently that there became any kind of lingua franca, which is another way of asking, you know, about this long period of you know, transmission of cultures, transmission of peoples through other cultures into other cultures, whether it's Spanish to indigenous people or one indigenous group to another. So that's kind of the question. Did Spanish become any kind of lingua franca here for this entire region or no?
That's a great question. So, I think in the 17th century, Spanish Castilian is not as widely spoken as it eventually will be. But, one of the important characteristics of these Ladino people, so-called, Hispanicized folks, is that they have some knowledge of Spanish. They are able to communicate, that is, they and perhaps read. That is why they're stealing the governor's mail. This type of information is presumably being interpreted. Something that kind of surprised me in looking at these criminal cases, because of course, you have the Inquisitor, who's usually a military officer, but he's almost always supported by an interpreter, who is usually a mixed or indigenous person themselves. And despite the fact that many of these accused people, like Juan Andres, have a Castilian name, in many cases, it's made clear that they don't speak Spanish, or they perhaps claim not to speak Spanish now that they are being, put to the screws. So the language that they generally use, or use in addition to Castilian, sometimes going back and forth, like the interpreter is asking questions in Nahuatl and then is writing them down in Spanish. So the real lingua franca, besides Castilian, I'd say probably more widely spoken amongst indigenous peoples, is the language of the Mexica or Aztec, or really sort of a northern variant of it that was first brought there by other allies of the Spanish, the Tlaxcalans. So people like the Tobosos, they speak a Uto-Aztecan language. It's no longer extant, but they would have been communicating using either Spanish or Uto or Nahuatl. So people, again, the most successful spies you've never heard of, when people are being tortured and interrogated, we can't assume that they are telling the truth. A lot of people claim not to know about anything they are being accused of. And that response usually elicits what they would say being put to the torture.
Wow. Alejandro Basilio asks, in effect, he's asking here that you mentioned, of course, the Spanish Empire, the U.S. Empire, and the French Empire. But what about the short-lived Mexican Empire? Does that make sense? Is that coming?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I
sure.
I just slipped and forgot to mention Mexico. Really, when I sort of was first working on the project, I thought it would extend a little bit deeper into the 19th century, but coming up against a certain clock. Right. And at this point, I'm going to conclude the final chapter. As I mentioned, we'll focus on, yes, the Mexican Empire and the War of Independence, the revolutionary period, in which I will try and re-narrate, that obviously well known story from the perspective of northern Mexico, specifically the indigenous peoples of the continent. So what do wars of independence look like for them? That's something quite different, I think, than the struggle of Morelos, Hidalgo, and others. And you're reaching that, as well.
With the end of your project, you're reaching that 1820s historical moment when all these emancipations occur all over the Spanish Empire, right?
Exactly. So
where this is where you want to take this.
Exactly. So trying to tell the story of emancipation, again, from the Beyond Mountains perspective.
Right, great. Adi Van Dyke asks, in effect here, what has your research shown about what happens to women and children, widows and orphans, as she puts it, in this long story of rebels and raids and enslavement and re-enslavement? Does that come clear, that what happens to women and children?
Yeah, certainly. I think, something that I've tried to hold at the forefront of my mind, and other folks have been really helpful in this regard, is, not to lionize, these rebel groups. They have, obviously activities and sometimes statements that we might describe as anti-slavery, but they themselves are deeply implicated in borderland slaving.
Mhm.
I fully concur with, the interpretations put forward by, folks like James Brooke, Andres Resendez, Paul Barba. All of these communities are deeply implicated in intercommunal violence that is often very gendered and as well as has an age component to it as well. So in terms of individual stories of women and children, they are present throughout my narrative, but of course we're bound by the sources as well. When people become victims in the early modern period, they oftentimes disappear from view. They are sold into slavery, they die of disease in prison. Their stories are lost, at least from our view. But they are also present, and I do my best to let their voices come forward, even though it tends to be sort of male and military figures who tend to dominate the action, the captains, the chiefs, who are in many ways victimizing these other people.
Yeah,
I hope that made sense.
No, it did. There's a question here, actually two, from James Rawlings. He's asking about how the Spanish, he says, hire Maroons, or were Maroons themselves exploited, captured, etc., which may be a way of getting at this larger problem, which you have addressed here, of indigenous enslavement, uses of slavery of some kind, this fluid world of freedom and slavery in this part of the universe. How do you address that? That is, as a scholar within this book, and then even outside when dealing with this in public, indigenous slavery is not always an easy subject in public. I've discovered. We did a major conference here on Native American slavery, U.S. and Canada. It's 8 or 10 years ago now, and man, that's a contested and complicated subject. So that's a very broad way of asking what James Rawlings asked here. He wants to know how the Maroons were actually used or not used.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just first off, it's obviously we're talking about, slavery, resistance, abolition. These are very difficult subjects, private, public.
Yeah.
Doesn't really make a difference to me. I'm speaking for myself. You have to spend a long time, reflecting on these issues, as a modern person who, has, I do not reside beyond the mountains. So, I always keep that in mind. As I said before, the greatest, spies you've never heard of, right? When people are like, oh, it's the most famous spy in history. It's like, doesn't sound like a great spy to me if we know their name and all this stuff about them. So there's a tremendous amount of unknown that I, do my best to work through and be honest where, the paper trail ends. Now to James's, particular question, I think is a really important one, and one that, I tried to gesture towards at the beginning, that is, not all Native peoples are taking up arms against the colonial regime. There are many people who seek, find, establish accommodation, whether it's, in the missions or other settings. There are Native peoples who acculturate certain elements of, Euro-American, African cultures as well. So there's a wide spectrum of responses to, the colonial invasion and all of the related disruptions. And, to that question, people don't need to just pick one and stick to it. Some of these rebel groups are eventually interested in, localized truces. They engage in diplomacy. Some of them go from being rebels to, what the Spanish and many historians call like auxiliaries, indigenous troops who fight along Spanish campaigns in order to defeat other rebels. I mean, I don't think I have ever heard of a single Spanish military force that takes the field without the majority being indigenous troops.
Is that right? Wow, that's interesting.
Well, maybe not the majority, but the idea of taking the field without indigenous scouts, guides, and troops, I mean, just unthinkable. You'd be cut.
They wouldn't know what they were doing or where they were going.
Have no, exactly. So it is a very complicated story, and the actors that I try and center are these rebel groups who have sort of pinned their collar to the mast, at least in the moment.
Not unlike back east, where the French and native peoples made so many alliances against the British and led to a world war. Anyway, could I get you one more thing, if possible?
Sure, I'm happy to take a few more.
Well, you mentioned this early on, that racialization is such a focus in the study of North American slavery, the American South, and so on and so forth, for obvious reasons. That's more complicated here in your 3 centuries, in this region of the world. It isn't always conceived through race, is it? Enslavement or bondage or bonded labor or and so on. Could you
Certainly.
talk a little more about that? Because I think for some Americanists, this continues to be I don't know if it's a dividing line, but it continues to be a complexity about your part of the world that is not always the case in our part of the world.
Yeah, that's a really great question. The first thing I would say is that, it's only because people have written, monographs, and other, and large works of synthesis, Edward Spicer and Jack Forbes, there's a lot of people who pulled the big picture together long before me. And there's also, of course, historians like Pekka Hämäläinen, who's focused on the Comanche.
Right.
I've learned so much from those folks, only because there are these monographs that have perhaps a more racial or tribal or sort of specific group focus, that I'm able to do this. So I do want to be honest and give credit where it's due in terms of making this work possible. But of course, once you, and all these other folks would hopefully agree, once you actually get into the sources, you notice like, wow, there's a lot of like non-Comanche people who live with the Comanche. Like Hämäläinen, I think says at one point, it's like, yeah, about 20% of people living in that society were, natives from other groups. So that's to me where it gets complicated, is that, okay, just the term indigenous or Native American, what have you, doesn't really get at the full scope of diversity. You have different native peoples living with different native peoples, and then there's also people of African and European descent living among them. So as opposed to defining and approaching these groups according to their ethnic racial composition, I just try and focus on their politics.
Sure.
So this to me is what brings these people together as so-called rebels, opponents of empire.
Well, and it's a world, obviously, isn't it, that where the stakes are about borders and valleys and resources and trade and crops and survival and so on and so on and so on, and race or ethnicity and so on may or may not be part of that.
Yeah, something else that really comes through in the sources is how people are described. So obviously the Spanish use a racialized language. They have a very complex case system and refer to people's, but they also, when they're actually like, okay, who are you with? What did they look like? They're asking questions about face paint, hairstyle. They look for arrow fletchings. I learned a lot of this from like Christina Snyder's work, which sort of helped me understand, how did Native peoples themselves understand and construct difference, physical difference. And they didn't necessarily use a language that focuses on skin pigment, but of course they have ways of differentiating between who is a friendly Indian and who is an enemy Indian. So it's often face paint, clothing. Of course, enemy Indians are usually naked. They're described as tattooed. They have certain arrow fletchings that are distinctive to them. And hence why people disguise themselves and dress up and use the arrows from another group to leave at the crime scene. So there's all these really interesting attempts to shift blame and to construct alibis that, make my work a lot more difficult, but that's okay.
But fascinating.
Yeah, certainly.
All right, one last question. We have a maritime historian attending here, Craig Marin, who's asking, here's the question. He's curious to know if your research reveals an acknowledgement on the part of the authorities, that's a broad category, that utilizing mobile laborers is dangerous but necessary to the success of colonial endeavors. That you can move laborers around is dangerous. Really an acceptance of, is it really an acceptance of a limited control or supervision in return for profits? I think you can read these.
Oh, yeah, I can.
How do you?
Yeah, I mean, I would
that-
certainly agree with that, sort of final assessment, really an acceptance of a limited control. Yeah, absolutely. I think, it'd be difficult to reach any other conclusion. Spanish, officers themselves, for example, they constantly acknowledge that nothing they do in terms of counterinsurgency works. They go out, they kill a few people, they capture a few people. That only makes people more resentful, but they use the captives to work on their farms, ranches, mines, etc. But in the interrogations, in the criminal cases, you do see, as Craig is asking, a real interest in people's mobility. Where have you been? Who have you been with? Where else did you work? Who did you work for? We want to find your employer so we can, send you back if you're, if we're able to do that. Another question they sometimes ask is, in terms of kind of getting at, ideas, politics, they'll ask, who are the most malevolent, or sort of, they'll use that type of word, amongst the people you were with? Who are kind of the hardcore opponents of what we are doing? And we're just kind of coming back to the language of criminality. Vagabondage is a major focus of regimes in early modern Europe, as it is in their colonies. So the control of this mobile pool of laborers, this kind of frontier proletariat that is moving around from place to place, looking for work, running away, is something that the authorities are very interested in, but totally unable to regulate beyond the acute application of violence. They can punish people and torture people, but as a systemic issue, they profit from it. So they're not really interested in solving it, to Craig's point.
Right. Well, and I might just add briefly, the Confederacy found out in a hurry that the more you moved enslaved labor around to work in your few factories and to work at the front with armies, the more they would escape.
That's the thing. This is something that's always stood out to me as since I've been introduced to Atlantic history. It's like, you have people who are at the very bottom or at the very margins of society. And when you learn about their lives, they travel hundreds of kilometers, if not thousands. And this is definitely, sort of a strong parallel to maritime history here as well. The people like Juan Andres who come before the authorities, they have been everywhere, man. They have really traveled vast distances. Again, not always by choice, certainly.
Hey, that'd be another new title to think about. Been everywhere.
Title's open as well.
Not quite original, but
nothing is.
God, this has been great, Max. We could go on and on. Thank you to all of the audience for the questions and for attending. And Max, thanks so much for this. We're glad we have you here. I think another 3 weeks or 2 weeks or whatever it is. And enjoy your research. And again, Max, thank you. Fascinating project. Can't wait for the book.
Thank you so much, David. Thanks to all the questions and to the audience. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Max. And thanks everybody for coming today. See you at